Hi, and welcome back to this week's episode of Quick Tip Tuesday. And our topic today is, does NGSS phenomenon have to be phenomenal? 5 myths of NGSS phenomenon busted. Myth number 1, if it's something fun, flashy, or involves hands-on activities, it's a phenomenon. So that's a myth because no, a phenomenon does not have to be flashy. A hands-on inquiry, quote unquote, lesson is not necessarily phenomenon driven. And not every fun science lesson is phenomenon driven either. But that doesn't mean that phenomenon driven lessons can't be fun. So, for example, making slime in the classroom may be fun, and it's often used as a science lesson, or putting baking soda and vinegar together in a cone-shaped paper mache volcano is fun and makes a big mess. It's not an NGSS phenomenon-driven lesson. It's not NGSS at all, unless there's some reason why students are doing that to make sense of a phenomenon, and that would need a little work. So what is phenomenon? So phenomenon such as smelling pizza in the cafeteria, mold growing on fruit in your fridge, going down a slide and getting electric shock, are specific examples of something in the world that is happening. So phenomenon is an event or a specific example of a general process that we can use our science knowledge, or our DCI, practices and cross-cutting concepts to be able to explain or predict these phenomenon. So again, flashy, smelling the pizza that's cooking in your cafeteria and you're smelling it in your classroom, that's a phenomenon. Not very flashy, but why? How come? How do we smell it? What's happening that's creating that smell that's coming from the cafeteria to get all the way up to your classroom and into your nose? Or my wonder often was like, where did this mold come from that is on my strawberries right now that are in my fridge? And that, again, what does that mean? Are there mold spores in my fridge? I mean, things don't just appear from anywhere. So anyways, so those are examples of phenomenon. It doesn't have to be fun or flashy, but it doesn't have to not be fun. And then so engineering, how does phenomenon relate with engineering? Engineering involves designing solutions to problems that arise from the phenomenon, and then using the explanation of the phenomenon to design a solution for that problem. So if you find out, if you make sense of why the mold is growing on your strawberries in the refrigerator, then knowing how that happens, perhaps you can design a solution to keep that from happening. And so that would be using engineering, and then you use those practices to solve a problem that's based on the phenomenon of mold growing on your strawberries. And so another example might be a puddle drying on a sidewalk. Not flashy, but it's phenomenon. So myth number 2, phenomenon are good to bring in after students learn the science ideas so they can apply what they learned to it. And so nope, one of the main characteristics, or you can call it the innovation or a non-negotiable of NGSS, is that it's phenomenon driven, meaning that our students will use the 3 dimensions to make sense of the phenomenon or solve a problem based on the phenomenon. And in doing so, while they're learning to make sense of it or solve a problem based on it, they're going to gain a deeper understanding of each of those dimensions. And so phenomenon starts the lesson. Doesn't come in later. And so we call the one that starts the lesson an anchoring phenomenon. So teachers use an anchoring phenomenon or 2 as the overall focus of a unit. Investigative phenomenon can be added along the way as the focus of an instructional sequence. And an instructional sequence is just another word for storyline. So if you're wondering what storyline is, we had a quick tip episode about that. Actually, that was quick tip number 2. So you can go ahead and listen to that if you're still wondering what the heck a storyline is. Okay, myth number 3. Phenomenon-driven instruction is over my students' heads. It's just too complicated. I've seen this actually lately. This myth about that phenomenon-driven, it's too complicated. But you have to remember that NGSS is not curriculum. So there is no set phenomenon that you have to use for your students. You get to choose. And so you have autonomy with NGSS and how you're going to choose a phenomenon to drive your instruction so that your students can meet the performance expectations. So if you feel that the phenomenon that is in your unit is too complex, well, change it. And so how can you pick phenomenon? You don't have to start from scratch. In the resources that I'll have at the bottom of the blog post that goes along with this episode will be resources to find units that are already done, and you can check out their phenomenon. So you don't have to start from scratch, but they need to be explainable using your grade appropriate DCIs, SEPs, and CCCs. So I suggest using evidence statements, and I put a link in for that, and the progressions of each dimension, and there's a link to that as well in the blog post, to help to choose a phenomenon that will meet your grade appropriate 3 dimensions. And so I also recommend using Paige Keeley's Undercovering Students' Ideas in Science series, which is wonderful. And many of those questions that, that's what they are wonderful to turn into phenomenon that will drive your instruction. And she is really great at providing lots of background information and how to use it in your classroom. So I suggest looking there for ideas too if you feel that it is too complicated. I also included a link to a flow chart that helps you start from a phenomenon and how to integrate it into your lessons, so you can check that out as well. But remember that phenomenon can vary in the amount of instructional time it takes to use it. So it doesn't have to be complex. It can be very simple and still be very effective. Different phenomenon are going to take different amounts of time to figure out, and a single phenomenon doesn't have to cover an entire unit or be complicated. And also remember that the same phenomenon could have different directions that you could go in. So this is quoting from one of the resources I have linked. Using the phenomenon of tree growth, a middle school teacher might want middle school students to develop and apply the disciplinary core ideas about photosynthesis and mitosis. But a third grade teacher might use the phenomenon of tree growth to have students want to learn and apply the disciplinary core ideas about life cycles. So again, one phenomenon can go in many directions. So what you would do is guide your students to the line of questioning that would lead to your grade level dimensions, and no need to panic if your student's line of questioning goes into directions that are not applicable to your unit's storyline. That's okay. You could just acknowledge their questions as being legitimate questions, but then explain that you're actually going to be going into a different direction. And that's science, right? That's what's so cool and so frustrating, as well as being the best part of science, is that there's always more questions to explore. And once you get an answer, there's at least 10 new questions that arise. So you never are going to get to answer all of them. And so again, it's okay then to, if your students are asking questions that are going a little bit too complicated, again, acknowledge their questions as valid and say, you know what, we're going to go in this direction now. But those are wonderful questions to explore as you gain more foundations in science or something like that. No need to worry there. So myth number 4, phenomenon in my NGS classroom, quote, can be generic observations or ideas or science topics. For example, like ecosystems, or students were doing an experiment, or volcanoes are. And that's a myth. So you don't want your phenomenon should not be generic or general. So you want them to be specific real world instances or occurrence. So you don't want to just study condensation. You might say, why is that water forming on the outside of your water bottle? Or instead of volcanoes are explosive, have your students observe video of specific volcanic eruptions, and then create a scenario where students, relevant to your students, that they'll have to try to make sense of, so specific versus general. And then, so why do we smell things? Like I mentioned at the beginning, you can talk about, why do I smell that pizza and it's all the way in the cafeteria? What is happening? How does that work? And then, so the 5th myth is that phenomenon is a nice to have or just a hook for students, but it's not central to our students' sense making. And that is a big nope. Phenomenon is a must-have feature of 3-dimensional NGSS science. If there's no phenomenon that students are trying to make sense of, That is not NGSS. That is not framework science. So that's one big flashing red flag that whatever you're doing is not NGSS aligned if it's not phenomenon driven. So go to the blog post on this. If you go to www.ngsnavigators.com/podcast, you should see by tomorrow for sure a link to this podcast blog post that goes with this. And I will have the links to everything that I was talking about and where the resources are for the information I just shared with you. And I hope you found this helpful. Again, if there's anything you'd like us to cover, any question, please email us at podcast@ngsnavigators.com or join our Facebook group, NGS Navigators, and ask the question there. And we'll start, we're compiling a bunch of questions that we have from teachers and trying to address them once a week in about 10 minutes or less. And I'm at 11 minutes, so I better end this right now. Have a wonderful rest of the week. And remember, you're phenomenal.